A world-class German chef held captive in an American camp is served a hamburger, a dish she considers so vulgar, it's almost an act of war. But in a surreal twist, this barbaric food begins to win over her fellow prisoners, threatening not just their pride but Margaret's hold as leader. Suddenly her greatest test isn't survival or escape, it's the impossible moment when a single forbidden bite could force her to admit everything she believed about culture, enemies, and herself might have been a lie. What if the true defeat isn't by war but by a hamburger? Margarete von Steinberg, chef to officers, graduate of Berlin's prestigious culinary academy, sat at a worn mess hall table in a Louisiana POW camp and stared at the hamburger with thinly veiled horror. For 12 years she dictated standards in kitchens where French generals dined and German traditions reigned. Now, as prisoner number 4098, she faced the ultimate culinary insult: a slab of minced beef squeezed into a greasy white bun with lettuce, tomato, and a sauce she refused to dignify with analysis. It sat on her plate, mocking not only her tastes but everything she'd ever known about civilization and victory. The afternoon sun burned through Camp Ruston's windows, casting a spotlight on Margaret's humiliation. Around her sat 40 other German women, not ignorant country folk but nurses, radio operators and administrators, educated, high-ranking, proud. Since the day of their capture, Margaret had become their unofficial voice, defending German sophistication against American excess. "Ladies," she declared now, voice low but clear, "this is what a nation without culinary history eats. Bread for workers, hamburger for carnivals. That they feed us this is proof they do not understand who we are." Some women nodded, others murmured their agreement, a few even laughed, a brittle sound masking uncertainty. But Margaret was no mere mouthpiece for the proud. She was a leader defined by control, precision, and never letting her enemies see weakness. Defeat, even in captivity, could not be allowed to rewrite her identity. Her role had crystallized in those first days, when she organized protests over powdered eggs and watery coffee, rallied the women to refuse American stew, and instilled in them the belief that to yield to the camp menu was to admit Germany's total surrender. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood by the serving line, watching as the German women prodded their food like scientists studying a new element. Margaret eyed her with cold calculation. Tall, mid-30s, confident and calm despite the heat and the mumbled insults. "Ladies," Mitchell said in careful English, "I know this is different. But hamburgers have fed American families for generations. I hope you'll try it before passing judgment." Margaret understood enough English to catch the gist, though she feigned ignorance. Her next words were for Petra Vogel, the young nurse at her side, and radio operator Anneliese of Bear, both barely 20, both staring curiously at the burger. "They think if they feed us enough we'll forget we're prisoners. But real standards cannot be starved out." And then the first shock. Anneliese, defying unspoken rules, took a bite. Chewed, swallowed, and unthinkably, her lips curled into a smile that could not be mistaken for disgust. "It isn't as bad as it looks, Frau von Stein," she said quietly, trying to bridge embarrassment and respect. Margaret's expression sharpened, as if her authority had been challenged publicly. "Fresh meat does not excuse primitive technique," she declared, louder now. But the aroma drifting from Anneliese's table gnawed at her own ironclad resolve. She tamped down involuntary interest, the trained professional battling the animal urge. Throughout the mess, other prisoners whispered heresy. "I miss dark rye bread, but the meat is good. It reminds me of street food in Munich." The rebellion spread not in words but in the sound of silent chewing. Margaret pushed the hamburger aside, dissected her potato salad with surgical severity, and ignored the corn, which she considered livestock feed. But a war was happening at her own table, a battle between pride and the body's demands. 3 weeks in captivity had not starved Margaret, but it had starved her of certainty. Her leadership depended on resistance. If the women started to accept American food, her authority would crumble. And for the first time she felt the tremor, that a single forbidden bite from someone in her group could unravel the cultural wall she'd built. The Americans, she realized, didn't need propaganda or force. All they needed was patience, plenty of food, and time for hunger to become stronger than pride. That night in the barracks, Margaret lay awake as whispers floated through darkness. The hamburger was actually good. I took seconds. American bread is sweeter, I like it. The walls closed in. Her leadership was no longer unquestioned. Lying in her bunk, she struggled with the unthinkable. What if she'd been wrong not just about food but about everything? Her pride clashed with her senses, her code with her survival. The next morning, Margaret descended to breakfast determined to restore discipline, but found even Helga Zimmermann, her oldest ally, quietly eating what the Americans called hash browns. Helga saw Margaret's glare and met it calmly. "Pride makes poor seasoning," she said, invoking her grandfather's wisdom. Margaret felt her foundation cracking. The first real defeat not by soldiers, but by a simple American meal and the irresistible logic of adaptation. Outside, the Americans planned a Saturday grill, where Margaret was invited to watch the hamburger process she'd condemned for weeks. The prospect of participating chilled her more than losing any battle. What if the forbidden food she'd dismissed was actually good? What if every conviction she'd clung to through war, captivity, and humiliation was about to die on the grill with a single bite? And as the women buzzed with anticipation, Margaret's world wavered. Control was slipping, and the most shocking challenge was not from guards or hunger, but from the enemy food she could no longer resist. She was about to discover that sometimes, the most dangerous surrender happens quietly, inside you at the table, fork in hand. Margaret tried to reassert her grip on the group, but the tides were changing. The rebellion against her leadership was silent, one bite at a time. Young nurses and operators began customizing their hamburgers, adding pickles, mustard, even cheese. What she had labeled food for carnivals was quickly becoming comfort, a weapon against boredom, captivity, and homesickness. Even her closest ally, Helga, confessed to sneaking a taste. "Pride makes poor seasoning," she'd said. The phrase haunted Margaret as whispers of, "It's actually good," echoed through the barracks. But pride clung tight. Margaret performed her role like a general defending a last outpost. She rallied her women, critiquing every dish, belittling American technique, and reminding them of the art of German cooking. She spoke with venom about food, but underneath her words, a current of doubt grew. Was she truly defending culture or simply her own authority? The Americans sensed the shift. Lieutenant Mitchell approached Margaret with an unexpected invitation. "Frau von Steinberg, you ran officers' kitchens in France. I'd like you to observe our hamburger preparation tomorrow." Professional to professional. The proposal was shocking, a challenge but also a gesture of respect. Mitchell wasn't defensive, she was confident, willing to let her food speak for itself. That night, the barracks buzzed with expectation. Margaret's going to the American kitchen. Will she admit it's good? The resistance was waning. Margaret's mind whirled, a vortex of dread, curiosity, and the realization she would face the very ritual she'd condemned. The kitchen at dawn was her second shock. Expecting chaos, she found discipline. Clean stations, fresh beef, careful grinding, precise seasoning. Mitchell's movements were practiced, almost reverent. 80% lean, 20 fat, Mitchell explained. The ratio is crucial. Technique, timing, don't overwork, just enough to shape. Margaret watched, professional pride flaring against what she saw. This wasn't barbarism. It was craft. Mitchell cooked the patties on a hot griddle, not pressing down, waiting for that perfect Maillard reaction. Toasted buns, fresh toppings, strategic assembly. Margaret's years of technical training recognized every principle, even as her prejudice screamed for excuses. When she finally accepted the challenge, a hamburger, prepared with care, her senses betrayed her discipline. The first bite was a shock. Contrast of textures, balance of flavors, rich beef and subtle sweet bun, tangy mustard, mellow cheese. Her trained palate found nothing to mock. It was not German, but it was not crude. It was simply good. Margaret tried to hold on to her old judgments. "Our methods are more complex," she said. Mitchell smiled. "But complexity isn't always better. Sometimes clarity is wisdom. Hamburgers aren't primitive, they're practical, born from adaptation just as schnitzel is." As Margaret took a second bite, her defiance crumbled, replaced with a shattering realization. Technique, respect for ingredients, and honest execution were universal. Her years in Michelin-starred kitchens had taught her excellence mattered more than style. She'd been fighting not American food but unfamiliar truth. She thanked Mitchell with honest words, "The technique is sound, the execution proper," and left the kitchen changed. But the greatest shock arrived that same afternoon in the barracks. A Red Cross letter from Berlin, her sister writing of starvation, bread mixed with sawdust, children growing thin. Margaret's world tilted. All her pride over culinary standards seemed obscene in the face of family hunger. She'd become a prisoner complaining about hamburgers while those she loved pleaded for crumbs. Helga read the letter, then looked at Margaret with quiet gravity. "The Americans feed their enemies while our people starve. Maybe it's time to adapt, not just to eat but to survive and to change." Saturday's cookout became a crucible. The camp buzzed, German women gathered, curious and uneasy, as Mitchell grilled burgers and Margaret began to explain the methods in her own tongue. Margaret demonstrated, gentle shaping, careful seasoning, proper timing. With each step, her own wall of resistance fell. The sense of forbidden surrender was replaced by something unexpected: pride in learning, in adapting, in finding truth on the enemy's terms. As the first burgers were served, women hesitated, bit, then smiled. "It's good. It's real food. Maybe we're not losing our dignity after all." Margaret watched her own transformation in their eyes, a leader no longer defined by what she rejected, but by what she was willing to learn. The greatest shock wasn't the taste of the hamburger, but the realization that the courage to admit you're wrong can change not just an opinion, but the entire fate of those you lead. The impossible had happened. The forbidden American food became their bridge to survival, and Margaret's strongest weapon became her willingness to change. Saturday's cookout was supposed to be a simple demonstration: Americans grilling hamburgers, German prisoners watching. But for Margaret, it felt like a final exam on everything she'd ever believed. Word had spread across Camp Ruston. Frau von Steinberg, the Iron Chef, would judge the enemy's food in public. The mess hall was electric with anticipation, prisoners whispering, guards curious. As Margaret stepped outside, the sight stunned her. 2 American grills sizzled in the sun, smoke curling into the sky like signals of surrender. Lieutenant Mitchell, face dusted pink by the heat, greeted her with a respectful nod. "Are you ready to help?" Mitchell asked in front of the whole crowd. Margaret hesitated. A single nod would mean acknowledging a world she'd spent years rejecting. She forced herself to speak. "Today we learn together." Mitchell worked the grill expertly, shaping beef, flipping patties, explaining every step. Margaret translated for her compatriots: gentle touch, good timing, proper seasoning. She felt the eyes of dozens of German women upon her, their trust hanging in the balance. With every sizzle, the divide between enemies shrank. Margaret's voice grew steadier. She saw change in the crowd. At first, the German women watched with skepticism, arms crossed, faces hard. But as the aroma wafted closer, rich charred beef, butter, toasted bread, the uncertainty melted. Women leaned forward, drawn by something more powerful than pride: simple hunger, curiosity, hope. Mitchell served the first burger to Margaret. She held it up for all to see, the gesture both ceremonial and defiant. All her instincts screamed against it, even as her hands trembled. The American officer's eyes held no mockery, only patience. "Judge it as a professional," Mitchell said, "not as a German." Margaret took a bite. Silence fell. She chewed slowly, the char, the subtle seasoned beef, the warmth of creamy cheese. She set the burger down and swallowed. "This is skilled cooking," she said loudly in German and then in English. "Different but good." Her words were a shockwave, breaking barriers her pride had built for weeks. Around the courtyard, something extraordinary happened. German women picked up their burgers. The first bites were hesitant, but the next were confident, smiling. Laughter echoed. For a few minutes, war and captivity disappeared. People became friends over food. But the moment of transformation brought its own crisis. Margaret's old role, keeper of culture, champion of resistance, became a burden. The internal struggle, more violent than bombs or bullets, raged in her chest. If she surrendered her pride, what remained of identity, of the meaning she'd clung to during months of defeat? Her answer arrived in the form of a letter, still trembling in her pocket. Her sister's words haunted her: "We are starving. Ration cards get almost nothing. Children cry for bread." Margaret realized the true scandal. While she had warred over culinary standards, her loved ones risked death for a morsel. After the cookout, Captain Morrison approached. "You helped today, von Steinberg. You led others to acceptance." Margaret handed her the letter, voice shaking. "My family in Berlin is starving. The only thing I want now is to bring them here." Surrendering to a hamburger was easy, compared to watching people you love go hungry. Morrison's response was another shock. "Your work today will help your request. You built bridges instead of walls." That night in the barracks, Margaret gathered the women. Instead of lectures, she spoke truth. "I was wrong. I judged without tasting, criticized without knowing. Today I saw that pride is often a mask for fear." She looked into their faces, some relieved, some still torn. Enjoying a good meal from another culture doesn't betray our heritage. It makes us stronger. An unexpected freedom coursed through the group. Resistance transformed to resilience, pride to honest openness. The women shared recipes, stories, and for the first time genuine laughter. Margaret lay awake in her bunk, no longer fighting the ghosts of pride. She had crossed an unthinkable line and survived. She'd learned that sometimes victory comes from the courage to change, not in the kitchen but in the heart. The crisis had been an identity at war with itself. The climax was its surrender to humanity, forged not by defeat, but by the shocking, impossible grace of a hamburger, made and shared by supposed enemies. As spring touched Camp Rustin, Margarete von Steinberg's journey reached its quietly powerful end. Once a symbol of German pride and resistance, she became the heart of transformation within her community of prisoners. Food, which had once been a means of protest, a way to preserve dignity in defeat, evolved into a bridge between enemies. Her journey from proud contempt to genuine appreciation began with one shocking bite of an American hamburger. But the true breakthrough came not just in taste but in humility. Margarete helped her fellow prisoners find comfort and connection with new flavors, and in doing so, rebuilt her authority not on stubbornness, but on understanding. With the help of Lieutenant Mitchell and Captain Morrison, Margarete petitioned to reunite with her starving family. When her sister and nieces finally arrived, the reunion was nothing short of miraculous. The girls, thin from the hardships of post-war Berlin, bit eagerly into hamburgers, a dish Margarete had once condemned. Gratitude overwhelmed pride and tears of relief replaced bitterness. In those final days, Margarete stood before her group and acknowledged her growth. True strength is admitting when you were wrong, embracing what is unfamiliar, and building bridges where walls once stood. She taught Americans to cook schnitzel. She learned to perfect the American burger. Margarete's greatest victory came not from surviving captivity, but from finding the courage to change, showing her comrades that healing, adaptation, and honest connection were more vital than any rigid tradition. When the war ended, she carried with her a simple, timeless truth. Sometimes, peace and unity begin with the humility to taste something new, and the strength to welcome it.